The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the greasy aroma of sizzling bacon filled the air, a familiar comfort in the small, worn-down diner on the corner of a busy Brooklyn street. The neon sign outside flickered weakly, its buzzing hum blending with the low murmur of tired conversations and the clinking of dishes. Behind the counter, Sophie Carter wiped her hands on her faded apron, forcing a smile as she jotted down an order. Her hazel eyes, though warm and kind, carried the weight of exhaustion, a quiet battle she fought every single day. At just 22, Sophie had already learned the harsh realities of life. Dreams of college and a bright future had slipped through her fingers like sand the moment her mother, Laura, had been diagnosed with a severe heart condition. The medical bills stacked up faster than she could count, and soon, there was no choice but to trade textbooks for double shifts at the diner. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but she never complained. She couldn't. Her mother needed her, and that was all that mattered. The diner was small, its vinyl booths cracked, the formica tables scratched with years of wear, but it was home in its own way. Regulars filled their usual spots, old men nursing black coffee, construction workers grabbing a quick meal before their next shift, and tired mothers shushing fussy children. Sophie knew them all by name, remembered their orders without needing to ask. She had mastered the art of hiding her exhaustion behind a practiced, cheerful demeanor. Even on the days when her feet ached and her body screamed for rest, she greeted every customer with a warm smile. But beneath that smile, worry gnawed at her constantly. Every night, when she finally trudged home to their tiny apartment, she was met with the soft wheeze of her mother's oxygen tank. Laura always greeted her with the same tired but loving expression, trying to reassure Sophie that things would be okay. But Sophie knew better. Time was running out, and no matter how hard she worked, it never felt like enough. She lived in an endless loop of exhaustion, fear, and quiet hope, clinging to the fragile belief that somehow, things would change. That maybe, just maybe, life would offer them a break. But she never expected change to walk through the diner's door in the form of a man who would turn her world upside down. The bell above the diner's door jingled, barely noticeable over the steady hum of conversation and the distant sizzle of food on the grill. Sophie didn't bother looking up at first. Customers came and went all day, most of them familiar faces from the neighborhood. But the sudden hush that fell over the room made her pause. Conversations tapered off, forks scraped against plates a little too loudly, and curious eyes darted toward the entrance. Something, or rather, someone now had shifted the air in the room. A tall man stepped inside, his presence commanding yet strangely out of place in the modest little diner. His tailored charcoal suit was crisp, his shoes polished to perfection, and his dark hair, streaked lightly with silver, was neatly styled. He carried himself with quiet confidence, as if he was used to walking into rooms where people expected him. But not here. Not in a place where people paid for coffee with crumpled dollar bills and counted every penny of their tips. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some recognized him. Others simply knew he didn't belong. Sophie, wiping her hands on her apron, finally turned to face him. She had never seen him before, but there was something striking about his sharp features and piercing blue eyes. He surveyed the diner briefly before stepping toward the counter. Without hesitating, she grabbed a menu and approached him with her usual polite smile. "Table for one?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the unsettling weight of his presence. He nodded once. "Yes, thank you." She led him to a booth by the window, one of the better spots in the diner, though the vinyl seat had a tear on the side. He didn't seem to mind. As she handed him the menu, she spoke in her usual friendly tone. "Can I get you started with anything?" "Black coffee," he said, his voice smooth but clipped. "And a steak sandwich." "Coming right up," she replied, jotting it down before hurrying off, aware that his gaze lingered on her a second longer than necessary. 20 minutes later, Sophie returned with his order, carefully balancing the plate and the steaming cup of coffee. As she set them down, she caught a glimpse of something in his hands. A worn leather wallet lay open on the table, revealing a small, faded photograph tucked inside. Her breath hitched. It was a picture of her mother. Not as she was now, frail, tired, fighting for every breath, but young, vibrant, and full of life. Her auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, her eyes bright with laughter. Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears. She blinked, convinced she was seeing things, but the image remained. There was no mistaking it. That was her mother. Her hands trembled as she gripped the tray tighter. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Sir, why do you have a picture of my mother in your wallet?" The air between them shifted in an instant. The man froze, his coffee mug hovering midair, his fingers tightening around the wallet as if to shield its contents from view. His face paled, his blue eyes darkening with something unreadable, shock, guilt, maybe even fear. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and for a split second, it felt like the entire world had stopped moving. He studied her face, his eyes flickering with recognition, as if he were seeing a ghost from a past he thought was long buried. Sophie felt her entire body tense as she watched the man's face shift from pale shock to something deeper, something almost painful. His fingers curled tightly around the wallet, his knuckles turning white as his gaze remained locked on hers. For a moment, it seemed like he wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came. Instead, his lips parted slightly, and in barely more than a whisper, he muttered, This can't be." Then, just as suddenly as the moment had begun, it shattered. Without another word, he reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it on the table far more than the cost of his meal. The next second, he was on his feet, his movements quick and rigid, as if the walls of the tiny diner were closing in on him. He didn't look back as he strode toward the door, pushing it open so forcefully that the little bell above it clattered noisily against the frame. And just like that, he was gone. Sophie stood frozen in place, staring at the untouched plate of food and the large bill lying on the table. The diner buzzed back to life around her, customers whispering, exchanging confused glances, but she barely heard them. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Who was this man? Why did he react that way? And, most importantly, why did he have a picture of her mother in his wallet? Her heart pounded as she reached for the money, her fingers trembling slightly. He had left in such a hurry, almost like he was running from something. No, running from her. That wasn't just a coincidence. This was something bigger, something important, and Sophie felt it deep in her gut. She could have let it go, pushed the thought away, convinced herself it was just some strange misunderstanding. But she knew better. The look on his face, the way his entire body had tensed at her question, there was something there. Something real. As she tucked the $100 bill into her apron pocket, one thing became painfully clear. Whoever this man was, he knew her mother. And Sophie wasn't going to stop until she found out how. The cold night air bit at Sophie's skin as she trudged up the narrow stairwell of the tiny apartment building, her feet aching from another long shift. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, exhaustion weighing heavy on her shoulders. Pushing open the door, she was met with the familiar hum of the oxygen tank, the soft mechanical rhythm filling the quiet space. Her mother lay propped up in bed, her frail hands resting on the blanket, her tired eyes lighting up as Sophie stepped inside. "You're home late," Laura said gently, her voice weaker than it had been that morning. Sophie forced a small smile, kicking off her shoes. "Yeah, the usual chaos at the diner." "You should be resting, Mom." Laura sighed but didn't argue. Sophie knew she worried just as much about her as Sophie did about her. They were all each other had. Just as she was about to sit down, a sudden, loud knock echoed through the apartment. The sound was sharp, urgent, completely out of place in the stillness of the night. Sophie's body tensed. No one ever knocked on their door this late. Her mother's brows furrowed. Who could that be? Sophie swallowed, a strange sense of unease creeping over her as she made her way to the door. Slowly, cautiously, she turned the lock and pulled it open just a crack, then froze. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was him, Alexander Grayson, the billionaire who had rushed out of the diner like he'd seen a ghost. Only now, he was here, at her doorstep, his sharp blue eyes filled with something unreadable. Her breath caught in her throat. "What? How did you find me?" "I need to talk to your mother," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Please, Sophie." Hearing her name from his lips sent a strange chill through her, but before she could respond, a weak, shaky voice came from behind her. "Alexander." Sophie turned just in time to see her mother staring past her, her face pale with shock. Her mother knew him. Laura's frail hands trembled as she struggled to sit up, her gaze locked onto the man standing in their doorway. "Oh my God, it's really you?" Sophie's head snapped back toward Alexander, her stomach twisting into knots. He looked just as shaken, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You know him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Laura's lips parted, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a voice heavy with emotion, she said, "Sophie, this is your father." The room spun. The air seemed to vanish from Sophie's lungs. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself, her heart hammering in her chest. "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible. He left. He was never in the picture." Alexander took a cautious step forward, his face pale, his voice raw. "I didn't know, Sophie." I swear to you, I didn't know. Laura's eyes filled with tears. I never told him, she admitted, guilt heavy in her voice. I tried to, but by the time I found out I was pregnant, he was gone. Sophie's breath came in shallow gasps. You're telling me he just left you? He walked away and never looked back. I was young, stupid, Alexander murmured, his voice cracking. I thought having a child would ruin my future. I was so focused on building my career that I left without knowing the truth. If I had known, Laura, if I had known about Sophie, I never would have left. His words did nothing to ease the storm inside her. Her entire life, she had believed her father was just some nameless, faceless man who hadn't cared enough to stick around. And now, here he was, a billionaire who had been living in luxury while she and her mother struggled to survive. Sophie's hands curled into fists. Anger burned through the shock, through the confusion. You don't get to stand here and act like you care now. You left us. You walked away, and you never looked back. Alexander's face crumbled, pain flickering in his eyes. I never stopped thinking about your mother. I kept that picture of her all these years because I never truly let her go. But I didn't know about you. I swear to you, Sophie, I would have come back if I had known. Silence filled the tiny apartment, heavy and suffocating. Laura reached for Sophie's hand, her grip weak but pleading. Sweetheart, she whispered, I know this is a lot, but maybe it's time we stop running from the past. Sophie's jaw tightened, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't know what to believe. All she knew was that this man, her so-called father, had just turned her entire world upside down. The weight of the moment pressed down on Sophie, her emotions spiraling between anger, disbelief, and confusion. She couldn't look at Alexander without feeling a surge of resentment. He had lived his life in luxury while she and her mother barely scraped by. He had walked away without a second thought, and now he expected what? Forgiveness? A chance to make things right? Her voice was sharp, laced with bitterness. You think showing up now changes anything? You think money can fix this? Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a sharp gasp cut through the tension. Sophie turned just in time to see her mother clutching her chest, her face contorting in pain. Laura's breathing turned shallow, her frail body trembling as she struggled to draw in air. Mom. Sophie's panic was instant, her hands shaking as she rushed to her side. Mom, what's wrong? Stay with me, please. Laura's lips parted as if to speak, but only a weak, wheezing sound came out. Her fingers clutched at Sophie's arm, her grip weaker than it had ever been. Terror gripped Sophie's heart. We need to call an ambulance, she cried, reaching for her phone with trembling fingers. Before she could press the call button, Alexander was already in action. His voice was calm but firm. I'm calling my private doctor. He'll be here in minutes. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and barked an order to someone on the other end. Get the best team ready at Mount Sinai. She needs immediate care. Sophie barely processed what was happening as Alexander swiftly moved into action. Within minutes, a sleek black car pulled up outside, and before she knew it, they were speeding through the city streets, Laura cradled in Sophie's arms as she fought for every breath. At the hospital, the best specialists were already waiting. Nurses rushed her mother away, leaving Sophie and Alexander standing in the brightly lit hallway, the sterile smell of disinfectant burning her nose. Sophie's arms wrapped around herself, her entire body trembling. She didn't trust him. She didn't want to trust him. But right now, he was the only reason her mother was getting the care she needed. Hours passed like a slow, agonizing eternity. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was calm but serious. She's stable for now. We caught it just in time. Relief flooded Sophie, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. She pushed through the doors, finding her mother resting in a hospital bed, her breathing steadier but her face still pale. Laura opened her eyes, her gaze landing on Sophie first before shifting to Alexander, standing silently at the doorway. A soft, tired smile touched her lips. Sweetheart, she murmured, her voice weak but steady, anger won't change the past. But maybe, just maybe, he wants to make things right. Sophie's throat tightened, her heart warring with itself. She wanted to hold on to her resentment, to keep that wall up. But as she looked at her mother, alive and safe, she knew she couldn't ignore the truth forever. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, late-night worry, and unexpected gestures of kindness. True to his word, Alexander covered every medical bill without hesitation. The specialists he brought in were some of the best in the country, and under their care, Laura grew stronger each day. Sophie wanted to resist, to hold on to her anger, but with every passing moment, it became harder to ignore what he was doing. He never once asked for gratitude or acknowledgement. He simply made sure that Laura had everything she needed. Despite this, Sophie kept her distance. She wasn't ready to accept him, not yet. He had spent more than 2 decades absent from her life, and she wasn't going to let a few good deeds erase that. But something about him, his patience, the way he never tried to force his way into her life, made her pause. He didn't push, didn't demand anything from her. He only made it clear that he wanted to be there, and for the first time, Sophie allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he meant it. One evening, after another long day at the hospital, she found herself standing outside his penthouse. She wasn't sure why she was there, only that something inside her told her to go. When he opened the door, surprise flashed across his face, but he quickly stepped aside to let her in. His home was exactly what she expected, grand, expensive, the kind of place that felt more like a museum than a home. But as she glanced around, her eyes landed on something familiar sitting on a sleek glass table. The old, worn photograph. She picked it up carefully, running her fingers over the faded edges before looking up at him. Her voice was soft, uncertain. "Did you love her?" Alexander's expression shifted, his normally composed face cracking with emotion. He exhaled shakily, his eyes glistening. "More than anything," he whispered. "But I was a coward, and I've spent every day regretting it." Sophie studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. She found none. Letting out a slow breath, she set the photo back down and crossed her arms. "I'm not ready to call you Dad yet," she admitted, her voice steady but cautious. "But maybe we can start with something small, like dinner." A slow smile spread across Alexander's face, his eyes filled with something she had never seen before, hope. "Dinner sounds perfect." The scent of warm bread and roasted vegetables filled the air as soft laughter echoed through the dining room. The table, elegantly set with fine china and flickering candlelight, was a far cry from the tiny, cluttered kitchen Sophie had grown up in. Yet, somehow, it felt right. Sitting across from her, her mother looked healthier than she had in years. There was color in her cheeks, a lightness in her voice that Sophie hadn't heard in so long. Alexander sat beside Laura, listening intently as she told a story from years ago, something about a silly mistake Sophie had made as a child. He chuckled, shaking his head, and for the first time, Sophie saw something in his expression she had never imagined, genuine warmth, the look of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. Sophie watched them, a quiet realization settling over her. She had spent her whole life believing she didn't need a father, that she and her mother were enough, just the two of them against the world. And yet, here they were together, sharing a meal, not as strangers, not as people burdened by the past, but as something else. Family. She wasn't sure what the future held, and she knew things wouldn't be perfect overnight. But as her mother laughed beside her and Alexander reached for the wine, pouring a glass for Laura with a familiar ease, Sophie felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, second chances weren't just for other people. Maybe they were for her, too. If you believe in the power of love, family, and new beginnings, then stay with us for more heartwarming stories that touch the soul. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more beautiful tales that remind us miracles do happen, and every story deserves a happy ending.